It's just like we're in the rut of thing. I feel like when I was in the Senate working on this, right now this is like we conceived a baby, and now I'm in labor, and we're going to birth this thing on January 1, and then my job with the governor's office is to make sure at some point it can sit up on its own and start walking. It is, and of course, this is within a backdrop of people who the policy overall either didn't want it, don't trust it, or actually I say don't trust it, don't believe it, or flat out didn't want it. And that's essentially where it is. And I kind of know what framework you're coming from based on how you start talking about it. There were people who wanted to talk about it just specifically from a revenue standpoint. The state is broke, we need to go on ahead and just do this. People are doing it anyway, just go get the money. And then there are people who are like, wait a minute, we're gonna give people licenses to sell metric tons of this. The exact same activity that destroyed whole communities. So then we decided, look, you can't legalize and normalize this without acknowledging the harms that were done to communities wholesale across the board in almost every instance where it was like over-targeting, over-policing, over things. So we know that usage rates across demographics are the same, but the prohibition of it really affected communities of color more than anybody else. So when we came up with the term, sociologists and university people came up with the term disproportionately impacted areas. And it really means 55% African American and 22% Latino, which is 77% people of color who were paying the largest price for the prohibition of this activity that we're about to legalize right now. So we used to say when we go into the negotiating rooms, and this is how I'd say it on the news, while we are legalizing and normalizing this activity, we cannot do that without acknowledging the people who suffered the biggest harms during the prohibition of the same said activity. When we'd be in negotiating rooms behind closed doors, it'd be like, it ain't going down like that. We ain't doing it like that.
What you not gonna do.
This is right. It's like people walking around like, what you're not gonna do, what you're not gonna say. And it was hard. It was hard because it was stakeholders from chiefs of police, state's attorneys, legal organizations, Republicans, Democrats, and then Illinois with 102 counties and 177 folks in the legislature who really have the only thing that they have all in common is the word state in front of their titles, either state senator or state representative, which meant people came from all areas across the state, from all kinds of different walks of life, bringing with them all the things they thought about cannabis in the first place, and for communities of color, it comes with trauma. So then we had generational issues. We had people, like over certain ages who were like, this is like the devil's lettuce, and I don't understand why you're doing this. And you'll make the whole state of Illinois high. And what's gonna happen when people start driving, or when people are like walking down the street, we're gonna walk past like plumes of smoke and all the rest of stuff, and it's like, A, stop acting like that's not happening now. Or they'd say, how are you gonna keep this away from children? And I said, the only way I can keep it away from children is if the government gets involved, if we start legalizing and taxing and regulating, because right now, guess what? It's all around your children. So then they'd say, well, you need to make sure that you keep this away from schools. And I said, the only way I can keep it away from schools is to get the government involved, because guess what? Right now, it's right next to the schools. And in the parks. And it was much easier for folks to get this than it is to get alcohol and cigarettes. Because there's no barriers. And there's no such thing as a drug dealer that walks up to your kids and says, can I see your ID? That doesn't happen. So we needed to put something in the middle of it. So every criminal justice concern that I ever heard, every public health concern that I ever heard, any criminal justice reform issue that I ever heard told me that this was the right thing to do. We need to be in the middle of this. Because right now, the current system we have isn't safe for anybody. Even when you extrapolate it out to the vape crisis. Those are illicit products on the street, untested, unregulated, because again, there are people who don't care about whether or not you will be safe at all. And if prohibition of alcohol taught us anything, it taught us that the only way to actually tamp down an illicit market is to put the government in the middle of it. So then we start thinking about what equity means. And equity in this context does not mean diversity and inclusion. It's a different topic, it's a different term. It means drawing a complete nexus from the legalization of one activity tied to undoing the harms that the prohibition of the same activity did. So you have to make those communities whole first. That's where disproportionately impacted areas comes from. when you have a misdemeanor or a felony conviction on your record, for communities of color, that follows you the rest of your life. A felony drug conviction means you cannot sign a lease. You can't get a job. You can't get a student loan. So even if you wanted to like get yourself back together again and go back to school, you can't get a student loan. So we were thinking about this in 3 different buckets. How do you diversify an all-white, very rich industry in a halfway illegal thing where the biggest barrier is access to capital? What do you do with the money at the point of sale once you actually bring it into the state coffers? And then how do you undo the harms that the prohibition of the activity caused at the same time? That's why that bill was 615 pages, because it was 3 buckets of equity. How do you diversify the industry, what do you do with the money, and how do you undo the harms? That was the driving force of almost every single thing that we did, every time we negotiated, every time we walked into a room, and I knew that for me, waking up in the morning and looking in the mirror, I look like, and I am a part of, the communities that this hurt the most. So I had a responsibility. I know whose shoulders I stand on. And I knew that people would look back at this time because it's sort of like pioneering. Illinois is the 11th state. But it's the first state to actually do it in a legislative process. So the 10 states that came before us did it by ballot initiative. And all that means is that they asked a very public question. Do you think this should be taxed and regulated like alcohol? And the public in all 10 of those states said yes. Then it's legal. It passes, it's on the thing, it's legal. And so then they have to start letting licenses out. And what happened when they let licenses out was that only people who were really wealthy and only people who had access to capital and didn't need to go to traditional banks, because you couldn't go to a traditional bank to like create, you can't walk into a bank and be like, I want to sell weed. Can you give me a loan so I get a location and ability to do this? You just couldn't walk into a thing to say that. So you only people who had access to money and knew, like, I don't know about any of y'all, but I didn't know anybody next to me that was like, so I got 5 friends with $1 million. Like, can you put $1 million up? Can you put $1 million up? And then we can all do this together. Like, I didn't know people like that. I've been to golf courses and golf clubs and country clubs and things like that, but I didn't know anybody in the course of my adult life out here in the south suburbs where I could just pull together millionaires like that. And I didn't know other people who did know that. So when the bill sponsors came, it was Heather Staines and Kelly Cassidy, and they both come from pretty progressive districts up north. You know, so I used to represent going all the way down to Kankakee, and there are some people in Kankakee County that thought Chicago started in Park Forest. So they would always tell me, they're like, you're up north. And I'm like, I'm not really, I'm just in the, I'm not really up north. They're like, no, you're like way up there. I'm like, no. Like Bradley Bourbonnais is just like home in Flossmoor. It's the same. It's like really, we're south over here. So we didn't know people like that. And so they asked for Jahan Gordon Booth in the House, who was from Peoria. So she's the only black person in central Illinois, surrounded by all Republicans, to come help us pass this bill, which was dangerous for her. Because people weren't talking about this out loud. And then they asked me, because I ran the revenue committee and I understood taxation, and I'd been president of a national organization, to come handle some of the tax issues as well as negotiating and dealing with the other caucuses, the African American caucus and the Latino caucus. And so it became the 4 of us going all over the place to every single legal state. I had traveled around the world, and I saw a situation where not only was the ownership in the industry very, very white and very male, but I could count on one hand the amount of times I'd ever gone into a facility and seen anybody of color working behind the counter. Like even as a bud tender, or the security guard, or anything. So then we started thinking about this is a growing industry that is growing and emerging. So what do you do to deal with that? How do you take people who have borne the brunt of this and put them in a position where they can either work in the industry or figure out how to own in the industry? How do you create that bridge? So the 4 of us literally went everywhere. We asked every legislator, what did you do well? What do you wish you'd never done? What do you wish you could do if you could do it all over again? Those are our 3 standard questions to almost everybody. And the biggest answer was access to capital was the hardest thing. So we knew we had a medical industry here that had been here for 5 years. And the medical industry here looked like the entire industry across the country. So we said, while we were trying to negotiate these things, the first people to turn over and go to the adult use space would be the ones who are already running dispensaries. We had a population of patients who were already accustomed to going into legally regulated spaces. We had a population of people who had grown from 45,000 to 95,000 patients across the state, who we didn't see any significant traffic concerns from. We had never seen, like, in all my travels, I've never heard anybody complain about the medical cannabis industry in every state. And there's 33 states that have a medical cannabis industry. 33 states have some form of legalization for medical patients. Then we had 10 states that had moved over to adult use. And when you add CBD stuff, that meant that 47 states across this country had some form of legalization of this cannabis plant somewhere. The majority of people live already in some place where it's almost already legal. The majority of people across the country already live in an area where it's almost already legal. So the issue for this isn't about what are we going to do when we do this. It's coming. It's here. Canada went legal. Mexico's now gotten it through their Senate. Could you imagine that? That means pretty soon, in the next 5 to 10 years, all of North America will be legal. So there wasn't a damn thing anybody could do to stop this industry from growing. So what we needed to do was change the way it was growing. So we took those initial operators and had them fund a revolving loan program. It's going to be worth $30 to $35 million, specifically to seed social equity applicants. Specifically to seed applicants who are coming in who either live in disproportionately impacted areas or have been touched in some sort of way, or their immediate family members have been touched in some sort of way. And what was the biggest barrier we noticed? Access to capital. And because you can't go to a bank, we, the state, said we'll be the creditor, which means the bankruptcy is not going to stop you. Because here's what happens when you have misdemeanors and felonies and excessive fines and tickets. It means you probably also have financial issues. It means you have credit. Sometimes there's credit issues. And so even if you could go into a bank, that'd be one of those things that'd be like, yep, nope, you're not allowed to do this. So at every turn, people who, again, were impacted the most were locked up and locked out of this industry. So we created the revolving loan program. You'll hear about that later. It's housed out of the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Once you apply for that, that is designed specifically for operating expenses. We removed the barrier of having to find real estate before you actually had a license. That removed the barrier, or at least lessened it. The application fees are half, and there's existing grants. Those are just on the diversification of the industry side. Then we said, okay, if that works, what we're going to do is study this. We're going to artificially suppress the market so there aren't too many licenses out in order for us to protect market opportunity for the equity applicants that come on board. And let me explain that. In states like California, and actually in states like California and say Oregon, it's one dispensary for every 10,000 or less people. In the 10 states, you have like one state, I think it's Oregon, it's one for every 6,600 people. In California, it's one for every 10,000 people. On January 1, we'll have about 35 dispensaries open. And remember, those original operators are the ones that seeded their license fees, seed the revolving loan program. We will have one dispensary for every 424,000 people in a state of 12.5 million on purpose. And the reason we did that is because we know that at some point there'll be a cap of up to 500 dispensaries in this state. And what we want to make sure happens that by the time equity applicants come on board, by the time they get up and running, in whatever category they end up in, that there's market share available for them to actually participate and compete. That is very different than what happened in any other state. California legalized for adult use in 2016. They took their original operators, they turned those licenses into the first ones that could actually do adult use, but they've not given out a single equity license yet. And that means those operators have been operating free and unfettered with no competition for almost 4 years. That is not happening in Illinois. We're only giving them 6 months. And while we built in patient protections, we're the only state that built in patient protections, so it's very difficult to turn your whole apparatus over to adult use. And we know there's going to be lines on January 1. So when people are worried about the fact that the first operators are going to come in and monopolize everything and nobody else can compete, you can't have lines and shortages and have people monopolizing a market. What that shows is that there's more demand than there are dispensaries to meet the demand. And that's designed to slowly, in phases, grow, because no other state has figured this out. And I'm not even saying that we have figured this out. We're at the stage now where we put all these things in place, and now we have to wait to see if it worked. The other thing that we built into it was that we would study it. January 1, we already tracked seed to sale. January 1, my responsibility is to study how this happens. Who got the licenses? How hard was it to get a license? How was the application process? What is the medical industry? What does the industry look like across the country? What is the medical industry? And what does it look like here? If we reduce the fees and give grants and provide access to capital, and then added more on-ramps to get into it. So now it's not just cultivator and dispensary. It was also transport and security and craft grow and infusion. Infusions. You think about this. Right now, you can't move product across state lines. At some point, when this becomes legal, and you will be able to move product sometimes, you will have somebody who makes really good brownies. Really good brownies. And they don't need an odor dispensary. They just make really good brownies. And they want to get that product on a shelf. Imagine what it'll be like when that product gets to be on a shelf and now it's legal across the country, but they started when we were still pioneering. So we added more on-ramps that become less and less expensive as you go down, so that we could tell the story about an emerging market, that there'll be so many things that you can do even if you never touch the plant. They're going to need lawyers and accountants and real estate professionals and people who do marketing and people who do PR and the people who design the clothes and the websites and the merchandise in the stores and the people who understand how to operate between the federal government and the state government while this is becoming legalized. This is an industry that's growing hugely. Transport, you got to get the product from a cultivator to a dispensary. And there's no cap on transport licenses. So we wanted to put people in a position where they could at least see what a possibility could be if we started doing drug policy differently, if we started doing criminal justice differently, if we started acting like we know better, so we have to do better now. And then we said, okay, what do you do with the money? 25% of all the revenue, point of sale of this product, for as long as it's going to be sold in Illinois, will be redirected to communities who were hit the hardest. Because you know what happens in communities who were hit the hardest? It's not just lack of ownership, it's also undereducation, it's underemployment, which leads to what? Violence. Because if you're not at work and you're not at school, what are you doing? So I needed to be in a situation where we could create, if you didn't own it, at least you could work in it. So we had to tell a story. We had to make names and stories real to people while we worked on creating a policy that was a sea change across the state where almost nobody thought we'd be able to pull it off. So the 25% of that revenue is for mental health and substance abuse and education and job training and technical assistance for nonprofits who actually do the work on the ground so they can have sustainable influxes of investment into communities over time directly related to the sale of this product. And then we contemplated how could we seal and get rid of up to 770,000 cannabis convictions in one state. This is the largest criminal justice reform bill in the country. That's what this is. Now people will talk about who owns, and we will hijack the conversation about who owns at the expense of the hundreds of thousands of people who we hope to change their lives. So this is about more than whether or not you can have cannabis at a really cool dinner party, or laugh at a movie, or a commercial where it seems to be pretty ubiquitous and everywhere. This is about criminal justice reform, it's about drug policy reform, it's about community reinvestment. It's about saying in 2020 that the harms that were started in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act, that was specifically race specific, Most people in the country at that time had no idea that this substance called marijuana that was now illegal was the same as the cannabis they already had in their house. Because they wanted to tie it to Mexican people. They wanted to tie it to musicians and undesirables and the people who were doing it. They couldn't make people illegal, so they made what those people did illegal. And for the next 80 years, our policies codified people in poverty and saddled them with records that made it so that every sentence was a life sentence. That's what we did. So this is about undoing that at its core. And then there's the money. And then there's the money. Because if you lead with the people, if you lead with a policy that's people-centered, then as the industry grows, we can do better. And look, I'm not saying that we're going to tamp out the illicit market, because right now we're still in that really weird gray space where it's illegal at the federal level and it's now coming state by state by state by state. And the best way in the world to tamp out the illegal market and all the things that go with that is if you end prohibition. So January 1 is the end of prohibition in the state. It's just the beginning of what legalization will look like. And I got to be in a situation where I drafted it, I helped draft it, and now I have to help implement it. It's a very rare position to be in. Most times we pass bills and you hope that it'll happen the way you wanted it to happen. You hope that you'll get a good governor or in someone in the executive branch and the agencies all work together, and you hope that what you pass will actually work. My job is to coordinate 7 agencies because it touches revenue and DCEO and health and DHS and agriculture and state police, and I'm missing one. IDFPR for the licensure. Thank you very much, Ms. DCEO. Ms. Alma. You guys will hear from her later. So I have to make sure everybody's talking to each other and that we're all pulling in the same direction. So what is hopeful for me, even though I pretty much had to unravel my life to be able to do this, like I went on a really big tour telling everybody, it's not you, it's me, my breakup tour. I had to leave the Senate and shut down the offices and totally rearrange and everything. Because I wanted to answer a very, very simple question. When we look back at this, time, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and I always talk about that being the magic of what politics is. It's not about how bad things are now. It's about what you want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. So when we look back on this at that time, and somebody asked the question, when you had an opportunity to change something, what did you do? What did you do? This is what I did. And this is why I'm here. That's all I got.